You were never meant to know this story. What I'm about to tell you is not the romanticized version of British nobility you were spoon-fed through glossy portraits and sanitized history books. No, this is a tale drenched in betrayal, dripping with poison, and stitched together with secrets so dangerous that generations tried to bury them. Picture this: a quiet English manor house, the year 1921. The lamps are low, the air carries a faint metallic tang, and at the head of a candle-lit table sits Lady Isabella Banks. Her face, pale and statuesque, is admired by many, but those who served in her household whispered that behind her calm smile, behind those steady eyes, lived something far more sinister. She was not simply a lady of title and grace. She was a manipulator of men, a devourer of reputations, a woman who learned early that in a world built by men, power could only be taken through seduction, secrets, and, if necessary, death. The records say Lady Isabella lived a life of privilege, attending balls, overseeing estates, and performing her duties as a wife of nobility. But beneath those records lies a darker archive, one that was deliberately hidden. Letters destroyed, diaries burned, testimonies silenced. Only fragments survive. Fragments that tell of affairs with powerful men, illegitimate children whose births were erased from church records, and a string of sudden, unexplained illnesses among those who dared to cross her. You see, history remembers kings, generals, and empires. But true power often rested with those who understood how to twist desire into control, how to make secrets into currency. Lady Isabella mastered this game, and like so many who ascend too far, too fast, she played it until it destroyed her. Tonight, you're not just hearing a scandal. You're stepping into the labyrinth of forbidden history. Every turn, every revelation pulls you deeper into the machinery of corruption that the upper classes never wanted you to see. They built entire systems of silence to keep women like Isabella locked in the shadows, not because she was unimportant, but because her story revealed how fragile the illusion of respectability really was. Think about it. For centuries, the British aristocracy projected an image of divine order, bloodlines stretching back to medieval knights, estates that symbolized permanence, rules of honor and tradition passed down like sacred scripture. But in reality, beneath the polished dinners and glittering jewels, they were crumbling. Bankruptcy, desperation, and moral rot ate away at them from within. And into that weakness, Isabella carved her throne. This is not a comfortable story. By the time you reach the end, you'll understand why her name was erased, why her legacy was buried, and why whispers of poison cling to her memory even now. Because Lady Isabella Banks was not merely scandalous, she was dangerous. London, 1894. The city pulsed like a beating heart of empire, fog swirling through cobblestone streets, carriages clattering past gaslit lamps, and whispers floating in gentlemen's clubs where deals were struck in shadows. To the outside world, Britain was at the height of its glory. But in reality, its nobility was bleeding. Bankrupt estates, decaying fortunes, heirs drowning in debts too shameful to declare. The great aristocratic houses, the very symbols of eternal power, were rotting beneath the surface. And into this decay stepped Isabella. She was not born with the right blood, nor the right fortune. By strict definitions, she should have lived quietly, in obedience, fading into history without notice. But Isabella possessed what the others lacked: the will to exploit desperation. She learned early that the aristocracy was a fortress with crumbling foundations. You didn't need to storm the gates, you only needed to find the cracks. Her marriage was no fairy tale. It was an arrangement, engineered by men who saw women as assets to be traded. But Isabella transformed the cage into a throne. Where other noble wives bowed to duty, she understood the true economy of her world. Men ruled publicly, but privately they ruled nothing if their desires could be used against them. Within a few years, Isabella was no longer simply Lady Banks. She was the silent architect of alliances, whispering into the ears of men twice her age, guiding their decisions with a smile that concealed steel. And when charm was not enough, there were darker tools. It was said she carried powders, white, tasteless, deadly in the right measure. An accident here, a sudden illness there, nothing ever proven, nothing ever admitted. But the pattern was too precise to be coincidence. What terrified her enemies was not merely her beauty or her cunning. It was the realization that she had no loyalty to the illusions they clung to. She saw through them, their rituals, their traditions, their so-called honor. To Isabella, these were not sacred codes. They were masks. And she tore through masks with merciless efficiency. Illegitimate children whispered to exist in countryside cottages. Affairs with men whose names were scrubbed from the record. A quiet network of servants and confidants who knew that their lady was more powerful than any lord she stood beside. But power built on secrets is a double-edged weapon. The more Isabella gathered, the more dangerous her existence became. For in a world obsessed with appearances, one scandal could destroy an entire lineage. And if Isabella fell, she would not fall alone. This is why her story is so threatening, because it reveals a truth that men in power will never admit, that their empires, their fortunes, their names carved in stone. All of it was always more fragile than the desire of one woman with the will to defy them. And so the question emerges. Did Lady Isabella simply indulge in affairs, illegitimate births and whispers of poison? Or was she executing a deliberate strategy, one that turned the collapse of the aristocracy into her personal rise? The truth is darker than you think, and we are only at the beginning. And now you are entering her world. To understand Lady Isabella's rise, you must understand the world that created her, a world built on hypocrisy. Victorian society preached morality, duty, and Christian virtue. But behind the lace curtains and cathedral sermons lay rot. Illegitimate children were quietly hidden away in orphanages. Aristocrats who preached purity kept mistresses in every quarter of London. And those who dared to defy the system were branded sinners, while those who manipulated it were celebrated as paragons of refinement. This was the battlefield Isabella stepped onto. She knew the rules were lies. And if rules are lies, then they are weapons waiting to be used. She wielded those weapons with precision. One of her earliest moves was scandalous in its daring. Whispers suggest that she entangled herself with a man far above her husband in both wealth and influence. A figure whose connections reached the banking dynasties of Europe. The affair was not simply lust, it was leverage. Isabella secured not just his affection, but his secrets, binding him to her in ways no contract could. Soon after, the first illegitimate child appeared, a child who, according to parish records, never existed. Some said the infant was sent away, raised under another name, protected by those who understood the stakes. Others claimed the baby never survived, and that its disappearance was no accident. For Isabella, the truth mattered less than the leverage it gave her. A whisper could ruin a man, and she carried many whispers. By 1901, Isabella's reputation among servants was terrifying. They spoke of her walking the halls at night, writing letters that disappeared by morning, holding secret meetings in her study with visitors who entered through the servants' door. One maid claimed to have seen Isabella pouring something into a glass of wine, her expression calm, deliberate, as if rehearsed. Days later, the guest who drank from that glass died suddenly of gastric fever. No inquiry followed. After all, inquiries were for commoners, not the elite. But what is power without resistance? For every secret Isabella controlled, there were enemies who wanted her undone. Noble families whispered against her, accusing her of disgrace, corruption, and moral poison. Yet none dared confront her openly. They understood the danger. If she fell, she would drag them all down into the abyss with her. The deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. Affairs were not accidents of passion. They were moves in a chess game. Illegitimate children were not scandals to be ashamed of. They were pieces of leverage, proof of connections others could not deny. And the poison? The poison was not just in the cup, it was in the system itself. Isabella merely weaponized it. This is the knowledge you were never meant to touch, that history's great families were often puppets, and those pulling the strings were not the men in portraits, but the ones who understood how to bend desire, secrecy, and fear into absolute control. And Isabella Banks was a master puppeteer. By the dawn of the Edwardian era, Lady Isabella Banks had transformed from a mere ornament of the aristocracy into its hidden tormentor. Outwardly, she was perfection incarnate. A hostess who could charm dukes, a benefactress who donated to parishes, a lady whose gowns and jewels made her the envy of drawing rooms across London. But beneath the embroidery and diamonds lurked the black heart of strategy. She was not living a life. She was orchestrating one. The most dangerous scandal of her life began not with poison, but with passion. The man was a respected industrialist, married, wealthy, and dangerously ambitious. Their affair, concealed by servants and shrouded in midnight meetings, soon produced something far more threatening than love letters: a child. In a society obsessed with bloodlines, an illegitimate heir was dynamite. It could destroy reputations, marriages, even entire dynasties. And Isabella knew it. What happened next reveals her genius and her ruthlessness. Instead of hiding in shame, she inverted the scandal. She leveraged it. To the father she whispered, "Support me, or this child's existence will be known." To her husband she suggested loyalty in exchange for silence. To the families who might expose her, she offered carefully curated rumors of their own indiscretions. Suddenly, every man who might ruin her was bound, trapped in her web of secrets. This was not desperation. It was strategy. Isabella had discovered a truth most aristocrats denied, but every one of them feared: that their entire system rested on fragile illusions. Lineage, legitimacy, morality, all could be shattered with a single rumor. And Isabella wielded those rumors like daggers. But power like this never comes without risk. Servants whispered about the child's fate. Some said the boy was raised abroad, hidden away with guardians who owed Isabella everything. Others swore the child died mysteriously, his existence erased to protect reputations too valuable to sacrifice. What is undeniable is this: records vanish, letters disappear, and silence settles like dust over the years that should tell us his story. This is no accident. This is deliberate erasure, and where there is erasure, there is fear. The families who feared Isabella most were not those she seduced or blackmailed, but those who realized her methods could spread like a plague. If one woman could master the machinery of lies and leverage, what stopped others from following? What stopped the entire illusion of aristocracy from collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy? This is why Lady Isabella's name was dragged through whispers of poison. Not because every death around her was her doing, but because fear demanded an explanation. And poison, subtle, untraceable, and terrifying, was the perfect symbol of the threat she posed. You are not just hearing a scandal, my friend. You are seeing the cracks in the fortress of power. And as we go deeper, you will understand why men of influence trembled at the sound of Isabella's name. Because she proved that even the most exalted empires can be undone by a single woman who refuses to play by their rules. It began with whispers. Whispers that followed her like smoke, whispers of poison. In aristocratic circles, reputations are destroyed not by proof but by rumor, and Lady Isabella's name became entangled with death itself. The first accident was her husband's cousin, a man known for his reckless gambling and sharp tongue. At a dinner, he mocked Isabella openly, hinting at her affairs, suggesting in front of others that her beauty was nothing more than painted deception. Weeks later, he was gone. Gastric complications, they said. Too sudden, too convenient. Those who served the household swore he had been vigorous and healthy just days before. The second death struck closer. A maid, young and foolish, discovered letters Isabella had hidden away. Correspondence with one of her lovers, rich in detail and damning in implication. Within days, the maid was found collapsed in her quarters, blue lips and clenched fists. The coroner blamed consumption, but consumption does not kill so swiftly. Those who whispered in kitchens late at night said the maid had seen too much. And then came the tragedy that sealed Isabella's reputation, the mysterious decline of her own husband. Once robust, he grew pallid, weak, and unable to eat without pain. Doctors called it a wasting disease, but the symptoms resembled something else: arsenic poisoning. Day after day, he wasted away while Isabella, serene and composed, sat at his bedside, feeding him broth with a silver spoon. To outsiders, she looked the picture of devotion. To those who knew the patterns, the truth was far more sinister. But here's the secret few understand. Poison was not only in the glass. It was in the psychology. Isabella didn't need to kill everyone who opposed her. She only needed enough suspicion, enough sudden deaths, to make people believe she was capable of anything. And once that belief took hold, it became its own kind of weapon. Men hesitated to cross her. Servants obeyed her without question. Friends remained silent, terrified that any word against her could be their last. You see, in a world ruled by appearances, fear is the strongest poison of all. Isabella mastered that truth. She cultivated an aura where scandal and death clung to her name like perfume. It made her untouchable, because when the cost of confrontation is your life, silence becomes the easier choice. But silence is never eternal. Behind the curtains of aristocratic estates, there were those who began to plot against her. They could not accuse her openly, they lacked proof, but they could attempt something more subtle, something equally dangerous: isolation. Rumors grew, alliances shifted, doors began to close. Isabella, the woman who once controlled every whisper, began to feel the noose of suspicion tightening around her. Yet even as her enemies gathered, she smiled, because she knew something they did not. Once a system is poisoned, it cannot heal. The rot spreads. And the truth is this: by the time they tried to destroy her, Lady Isabella had already ensured they were destroying themselves. By 1907, Lady Isabella Banks was no longer merely whispered about in salons and servants' quarters. She had become a spectre, haunting the very corridors of power. Her name carried both allure and dread. To some she was a temptress, to others a black widow. But to those who understood the stakes, she was something more dangerous. A woman who had pierced the veil of aristocratic illusion. Her enemies gathered in silence. They could not bring her to trial. There was no evidence, no witnesses willing to speak. But they could attempt something far more insidious: social annihilation. They began to exclude her from dinners, quietly withdraw invitations, and plant rumors in newspapers about her instability. A whisper of hysteria here, a rumor of impropriety there. The goal was clear: to paint Isabella not as a mastermind but as a madwoman, to transform fear of her power into ridicule. But Isabella was never a victim. She saw the shift coming before most of her enemies realized it had begun, and she responded with precision. Letters, forged and real, began to circulate. Letters implicating some of the very men who sought to isolate her in affairs, financial scandals, and worse. A few of these letters found their way into the hands of journalists who were more than willing to publish them for the right price. Suddenly, the noble families whispering against her found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to deny accusations, begging their mistresses to remain silent, bribing editors to retract damaging headlines. One by one, those who moved against Isabella discovered that her reach extended further than they had believed. She was no longer merely a scandalous figure in the drawing room. She had become a shadow presence in the machinery of reputation itself. But with every move, the game grew more dangerous. For while aristocrats feared disgrace, there were others who dealt in harsher currency. Some claimed that one of Isabella's most powerful lovers, a banker whose fortune underpinned half the county's estates, ordered her silencing. A carriage accident nearly killed her on a foggy night outside London. Brakes snapped, horses panicked, the coach overturned. She emerged bruised but alive. Those who saw her afterward swore that she smiled, a cold, knowing smile, as if daring them to try again. And here lies the truth they could never admit. Isabella was not merely a scandal, they were. She was a mirror, reflecting their corruption back at them, showing the world that behind their coats of arms and sermons of purity lay rot, deceit, and lust. They hated her not because she was guilty, but because she exposed them all by surviving. This is where her story becomes more than history. It becomes revelation. Because once you see that the system was built on lies, once you realize those lies were protected by fear, you cannot go back to innocence. And neither could the men who tried to bury Lady Isabella Banks. She had already poisoned them, not with arsenic, but with truth. Of all her scandals, none proved more dangerous or more enduring than the whispers of her children. The official record shows none. No christenings, no parish entries, no noble heirs bearing her name. Yet the unofficial record, the living bloodlines that still circulate in England's veins, tells a darker story. The first rumours began after her affair with the industrialist. A boy born in secrecy, spirited away to the countryside, raised under a false name. Some said he grew into a man of influence himself, climbing through the ranks of London's financial world. Others insisted he never survived infancy, that Isabella herself ended his life rather than risk exposure. The truth, buried beneath layers of silence, remains contested. But the mere possibility was enough to frighten those who surrounded her. Later, another affair, this time with a titled aristocrat whose estate was crumbling under debt. Their bond was transactional at first, but it became intimate, producing what many believe was a daughter. Servants whispered of Isabella sneaking away to a distant convent, the child placed into the care of nuns sworn to silence. Decades later, a woman bearing an uncanny resemblance to Isabella appeared in society, married to a wealthy landowner. Coincidence? Or the return of blood that was never meant to be acknowledged? For Isabella, these children were not just lives, they were leverage. Proof of her reach. Proof of her defiance against the rigid bloodlines that sought to exclude her. Each illegitimate heir was a knife pressed to the throat of the aristocracy, a reminder that their world of purity was an illusion waiting to be shattered. But leverage cuts both ways. The existence of such children made her enemies more desperate, more ruthless. They feared her not only as a seductress, but as a threat to the entire hereditary order. Imagine what it meant in their world. If Isabella's children, born in scandal, could inherit wealth or influence, what became of the sacred hierarchy that had ruled England for centuries? It was heresy against blood itself. The response was predictable. Records destroyed, names changed, witnesses silenced. It is no accident that we cannot trace her bloodline clearly today. It was erased with purpose, yet erasure itself is proof. The absence of evidence is the evidence. For if there were nothing to hide, there would be no reason to burn the archives. And here lies the forbidden truth. The aristocracy itself was filled with illegitimate blood. They condemned Isabella for doing openly what they had done in secret for generations. The only difference was that she turned it into power. She weaponized it. The more they tried to silence her, the more unstoppable she became. And yet every weapon she wielded, affairs, children, poison, secrets, drew her closer to the abyss. For in a world built on lies, the one who knows too much is marked for destruction. And Isabella Banks knew everything. No empire of shadows lasts forever. Even the cleverest manipulator eventually stirs enemies bold enough, or desperate enough, to strike. For Lady Isabella, the first cracks appeared not in the grand halls of the aristocracy, but in the whispers of the servants. A maid who once adored her suddenly left her service, vanishing into the London streets. Weeks later, rumours began to circulate in drawing rooms and parlours. Rumours that Isabella poisoned her rivals, that she kept children hidden away, that she manipulated men like pawns. At first, society dismissed them. After all, women were rarely given credit for such power. But Isabella knew better. Rumours are not wind, they are fire, and fire spreads. Soon after, a banker she once held sway over turned against her. Documents were produced, altered perhaps, but convincing enough, suggesting financial improprieties. Meetings grew tense, allies began to hesitate, and men who once bowed to her charm now looked at her with suspicion. The walls of secrecy she had built so carefully began to tremble, and then came the dinner party. It was meant to be a quiet evening among friends, though none could truly be called friends in her world. Midway through the night, a guest rose suddenly, pale and sweating, before collapsing at the table. He was dead before the physician arrived. Whispers flew instantly. Isabella's glass had been near his hand. Isabella's hand had poured his wine. Yet no charge was brought. The coroner ruled apoplexy. But in society's eyes, the verdict mattered little. The shadow of guilt had already been cast. For the first time, Isabella felt the sting of isolation. Invitations slowed. Letters from her allies went unanswered. The salons that once opened their doors now found excuses to keep her away. She had not yet been destroyed, but she had been marked. The game had shifted. Her enemies no longer played defense. They were plotting her downfall, and they had a weapon Isabella could never fully control: her past. Every secret child, every lover, every poisoned cup, she had built her empire on dangerous truths. But dangerous truths, once loosed, are impossible to cage. The aristocracy, bound together by their own hypocrisy, could tolerate many sins. But they could not tolerate exposure. Isabella had turned their sins into her power, and for that she had to be silenced. Not just disgraced, not just ruined. Silenced completely, and so the net began to tighten. Letters intercepted, witnesses bribed, servants disappearing. Step by step the stage was being set, not just for Isabella's fall, but for her erasure. Because in a world where blood and secrecy rule, the punishment for knowing too much is always the same. You are buried with your secrets. When Isabella realized the tide had turned against her, she did not retreat, she attacked. For her, desperation was never weakness, it was fuel. She knew that in a society built on silence, the one who speaks first wields the blade. And so she sharpened her tongue, turning whispers into weapons. The first counter-move came in the form of letters. Dozens of them, hand-delivered under seal, to men whose reputations could not withstand exposure. Affairs, debts, secrets whispered in candlelit bedrooms. Isabella had recorded them all. Her message was clear: if I fall, you fall with me. Some paid her in gold, others paid in silence, but all of them, for a time, stayed their hand. Yet enemies have long memories, and fear only works when the blade is visible. As weeks turned into months, resistance hardened. A group of aristocrats, men of wealth, power, and old names, met quietly in drawing rooms to plot her removal. They did not plan to confront her in court. No. They planned to erase her so thoroughly that her story would dissolve into rumor and contradiction. Sensing this, Isabella shifted her focus. She doubled down on her alliances with those outside the aristocracy: ambitious bankers, radical politicians, foreign industrialists. She understood that the old bloodlines feared contamination above all else. If she could entwine her legacy with those they despised, she could make her survival their humiliation. But survival was not enough. Isabella wanted triumph, and so she reached once more for her deadliest weapon: poison. Some say she began experimenting with new concoctions, powders slipped into brandy, tinctures hidden in medicine bottles. Servants whispered of her late-night rituals, vials scattered across her desk, handwritten notes describing the effects of each mixture. And then came the incident that confirmed every suspicion. A viscount who had openly mocked her in Parliament fell suddenly ill. His death was declared natural, but too many remembered his words: "Lady Isabella Banks is a cancer to our society." Within weeks he was in the ground. Coincidence, perhaps, but to those who knew her, it was proof that Isabella still ruled the game. Even as the hunters closed in, yet every act of defiance, every poisoned chalice, every blackmail letter only tightened the noose. Her enemies grew more cautious, more patient. They knew they could not strike openly, but they could wait. And waiting in a world of shadows is its own form of killing. For Isabella was now caught in a paradox of her own making. The more power she wielded, the more enemies she created. And in the end, power built on fear is not a fortress, it is a tomb waiting to close, and the tomb was already being dug. The first attempt to silence Isabella came cloaked not in outrage, but in civility. That was how the aristocracy operated: murder dressed as etiquette, destruction wrapped in silk. It began with an invitation. A lavish weekend gathering at a country estate outside Bath, hosted by a family with ties stretching back to the Norman conquest. For Isabella, such invitations had grown scarce, so she recognized the danger immediately. Yet she accepted. To decline would signal weakness. To appear was to prove she was still untouchable. The carriage ride was long and silent, her thoughts sharp as blades. She knew eyes would be on her. She dressed accordingly: dark silk, a necklace heavy with stones rumored to have belonged to a poisoned queen. When she entered the grand hall, conversations faltered. Every glance was calculation, every smile a mask. For 2 days the gathering proceeded without incident. Dinners by candlelight, hunts across manicured fields, whispered conversations in drawing rooms. Isabella played her role with perfection, laughing at the right moments, sipping wine with effortless poise. But beneath the surface, tension coiled like a serpent. She felt it in the servants' glances, in the way the host's wife avoided her, in the odd absence of trusted allies. And then came the final dinner. The table glittered with silver and crystal. Glasses were filled, toasts were made. But Isabella noticed the detail no one else seemed to see. Her glass of wine was poured not from the common decanter, but from a separate bottle brought quietly to her place. The gesture was subtle, deliberate. She did not drink. Not a drop. Instead, she smiled. She raised her glass, touched it lightly to her lips, and set it down untouched. Hours later, a servant who had carried the wine collapsed in the kitchen, writhing in agony. By dawn, he was dead. The coroner would blame bad shellfish. Isabella knew better. The poison meant for her had claimed another. She left the estate the next morning, her carriage vanishing into the mist. Behind her, silence hung heavy in the halls. Those who had plotted her end now faced a chilling truth. Isabella was not only aware of their schemes, she had survived them, but survival came at a cost. To live in such a world was to walk constantly on the edge of death. Each day demanded greater cunning, greater ruthlessness. The failed attempt was not a victory, it was a warning. The hunt had begun in earnest. And Isabella Banks was no longer merely a scandalous woman. She was now an enemy of the most powerful families in England. Isabella had always been hunted. From the day she stepped into London society, the whispers clung to her like smoke. But after that failed poisoning, something in her shifted. She realized survival was no longer enough. To endure was weakness. To live, she must become the one who struck first, predator, not prey. Her response was calculated. She began gathering secrets the way others gathered jewels. Servants who had once served tea in stately homes found themselves in her employ, bringing tales of midnight quarrels, illegitimate heirs, gambling debts, and hidden infidelities. Letters stolen from bedside tables were quietly copied before being returned. Even priests whispered in her ear, though they never realized their confessions were being twisted into weapons. One by one, she compiled her arsenal. A viscount who had fathered a child with a chambermaid, a baroness who fed her husband arsenic in small doses, a banker who embezzled funds meant for the crown. Names, dates, proofs, all catalogued with surgical precision, and then the strikes began. At first, it was subtle. A letter left in the wrong hands. A rumor seeded in the right ear. A scandal breaking across a dinner table like thunder. Men who had once mocked her now turned pale when she entered the room. Women who had whispered about her illegitimate children found their own betrayals dragged into the light. Her enemies quickly learned. Isabella did not merely defend herself, she destroyed, but it wasn't just vengeance. It was evolution. Every scandal she orchestrated tightened her grip on power. The same families who had plotted to poison her now found themselves chained to her by fear. They couldn't expose her without exposing themselves. The poison had failed, but she had found a more effective venom. Information. And yet, with every victory, her soul darkened further. The laughter she once carried into salons grew sharp, edged with cruelty. Friends began to avoid her, unable to tell whether her gaze carried affection or calculation. Some said she no longer cared for pleasure at all, that she lived only for the thrill of the trap, the destruction of her enemies. Her lovers, too, were no longer companions but pawns. Some were seduced not for love but for access. Sons of dukes, heirs to fortunes, even married men whose weaknesses could be exploited. She left behind a trail of broken hearts and ruined reputations, and for Isabella, that trail was a throne. By the mid-1870s, she was untouchable again, but in a new way. Not through beauty, not through wealth, but through fear. She had turned the aristocracy's greatest weakness, their obsession with secrets, into her greatest strength. Still, deep inside her, she knew the truth. Fear is never permanent. The moment her enemies found courage or desperation, they would strike again. And next time, they would not send poisoned wine. They would send men with knives, and so Isabella prepared. not for survival, but for war. And they would not fail twice. There comes a moment in every power struggle when fear alone is not enough, when whispers in drawing rooms give way to plans scrawled in candlelit chambers. For Isabella Banks, that moment arrived in the winter of 1877, when her enemies stopped hiding their intentions. They wanted her gone, utterly, completely, permanently. It was not rage that drove them. It was survival. Isabella had become too dangerous. She knew too much. Every affair, every betrayal, every crime of the high-born classes had been turned into a chain that bound them to her will. And chains breed hatred in those forced to wear them. The first meeting took place in a townhouse along Grosvenor Square. A viscount whose reputation she had nearly shattered presided at the head of the table. Around him sat a half-dozen figures, men with names carved into the very stones of England's history. They spoke plainly. Isabella had to be silenced. The question was how. One suggested scandal. Frame her for theft, or for the kind of debauchery that even London's libertines would shun. Another proposed exile, quietly fund her departure to the continent, never to return. But these were fantasies. Isabella was too clever, too resourceful. Then the Viscount leaned forward and spoke the words the others had been avoiding. She must be removed. Removed. It was the language of power, the euphemism of murder, and no one at that table dared object. By the following week, plans were in motion. Money was exchanged discreetly. Messages were carried in coded language, and soon the name of a man surfaced, a figure whispered about in both the underworld and the drawing rooms. A man who specialized in the untraceable erasure of problems. His services were not cheap, but neither was silence. Isabella had enemies, yes, but she also had instincts. For weeks, she felt the air grow heavier around her, as if eyes were always on her back. Servants reported strangers loitering near her home, watching, waiting. Once, while riding through Hyde Park, she noticed the same face appear twice among the trees, shadowing her path. But what chilled her most was not the stalking. It was the sudden stillness of her enemies. The gossip had quieted, the whispers ceased, and that silence, in a city built on rumor, was the loudest threat of all. Still, Isabella did not retreat. She did not hide. She leaned into the storm. She began hosting gatherings again. Lavish, daring, provocative. She wanted them to believe she was untouchable. She wanted the hunter to step closer, to think she was unaware. But in truth, Isabella Banks was preparing. If they were sending a wolf for her, she intended not merely to survive. She intended to tame it. The man they sent for Isabella was no common criminal. He was a shadow stitched into flesh, a presence felt rather than seen. He had been called many things. Fixer, cleaner, silencer, but among those who truly understood, he was known simply as the huntsman. His reputation was legend. No hesitation, no conscience, no failures. But Isabella Banks was not like his other prey. The first encounter came not as a knife in the dark, but as a warning disguised as an accident. A carriage wheel loosened on a familiar road, nearly sending her coach tumbling into a ravine. Her driver swore it had been tampered with. Days later, a gas lamp in her home hissed open in the night, filling her room with fumes. She awoke coughing, eyes watering, only because her cat clawed at the sheets in panic. These were not random. They were tests. The huntsman was measuring her caution, probing her reflexes, learning her patterns, and Isabella in turn began to study him. Instead of shrinking, she baited the trap. She walked at night through dimly lit streets knowing he would follow. She dismissed her guards at crucial moments, forcing him to step closer. In the reflection of shop windows, she caught glimpses of his silhouette. In the shifting crowd of Covent Garden, she felt his gaze linger like a blade at her throat. But here was the truth. The huntsman had underestimated her. He believed her to be a woman of privilege and scandal, a target softened by years of luxury. He did not yet understand that Isabella had lived half her life surrounded by poisoners, liars and predators, and had learned to become one herself. One evening, she left an envelope in plain sight on her writing desk, knowing he would break in to read it. Inside was not a letter, but a message written in her precise hand. I know who you are. I know why you are here. When you are ready, come to me yourself. Do not skulk in shadows. Face me. When he found it, the huntsman did something unexpected. He laughed. For the first time in his career, a victim had turned the hunt into an invitation. And though he could have killed her that very night, he did not. He wanted to see what kind of creature dared to mock him. From that point, their relationship transformed into a duel, not of weapons, but of wills. Every attempt he made to corner her, she slipped free with a calculated grace. Every time she set a stage for him, he recognized the bait, but admired the audacity. Predator and prey blurred into one another, until it was no longer clear who hunted whom. And beneath the deadly game, a darker possibility began to take root. Was this truly an assassination plot? Or had Isabella found in the huntsman something far rarer? An equal. It is a dangerous thing when enemies begin to see themselves in each other. For Isabella Banks and the huntsman, what began as a dance of death transformed into something stranger, something forbidden. Their meetings were not spoken of, for they were never truly meetings. A shadow at the edge of her carriage window, a figure passing too close in a crowded market. A candle extinguished in her room, only for her to find a single glove left behind on her desk. He could have killed her a dozen times. She could have betrayed his presence with a single word, yet neither moved to end it. Instead, they circled each other. For the huntsman, Isabella was unlike any mark he had ever pursued. She did not run. She did not beg. She dared him. Every calculated risk she took, every whisper she seeded in the air was a message. I am not afraid of you. And fear, he realized, had been his truest weapon. Without it, his blade was dull. For Isabella, the huntsman was a mirror she had never encountered. Here was a man who lived outside the codes of society, unbound by its hypocrisies. Like her, he had crafted himself into a weapon, a survivor in a world where survival meant compromise, cruelty, and secrecy. In him, she saw not just danger, but recognition. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that they did meet once in the dead of night. No witnesses, no evidence, only speculation. Some said he came to her chambers armed, but left without drawing his blade. Others swore she invited him to her table, poured him wine, and for a single evening they spoke not as hunter and hunted, but as equals. Whatever truth lies there is buried, but what followed cannot be denied. The attempts on her life ceased, not because her enemies had relented, but because the huntsman no longer obeyed their command. He lingered still, watching but not to strike, to guard. The predator had become her silent shield, and this shift sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. Those who had hired him realized too late what they had created. By sending the most dangerous man in London after Isabella, they had given her something greater than protection. They had given her legend. Now the rumors grew darker, more potent, that she had seduced death itself, that the executioner had bent the knee. For the first time, Isabella was no longer simply feared for her cunning or her poisons or her scandals. She was feared because she seemed untouchable, allied with forces no mortal dared challenge. But power gained through fear is a double-edged blade. For the deeper the shadows grew around her, the more isolated she became. Friends vanished, allies shrank away. Even lovers turned cold, unwilling to risk entanglement with a woman whispered to consort with her would-be assassin. She had won, yes. But victories of this kind always demanded sacrifice, and Isabella Banks was beginning to realize the cost of hers. Every empire built on secrets eventually collapses under their weight. For Isabella Banks, the cracks began as whispers, as all great downfalls do. By the early 1880s, she was no longer the glittering scandal of London's ballrooms. She was something darker, more spectral. Men still spoke her name, but never allowed in public. Women still envied her beauty, but recoiled at the chill in her gaze. The huntsman still lingered, unseen yet never absent. But his protection, like her power, had become a prison. Her enemies had failed to kill her. But they had succeeded in something subtler, more insidious. They had isolated her. No invitation arrived without suspicion. No friendship survived the poison of rumor. and every glance across a drawing room carried the same silent accusation: she knows too much. In her townhouse, she surrounded herself with tokens of the past: portraits of dead lovers, rings pried from scandalous affairs, letters she could never burn because they were her last leverage against the world. She drank heavily. She spoke to shadows. Some nights, servants swore they heard her conversing with voices no one else could hear. And then came the final rumor, the one that sealed her fate. A whispered tale that she had poisoned not rivals, not husbands, not lovers, but her own illegitimate child, born in secret, hidden away in a convent school. Proof never surfaced. Perhaps it was a lie. Perhaps it was truth. But in a society already hungry for her destruction, the rumor was enough by then. Even the huntsman could not protect her. His loyalty, if loyalty it ever was, grew brittle with time. Some said he abandoned her. Others claimed he ended her himself, bound by an oath to the very men who had once paid him. Still others believed he loved her until the end, but could not stop the spiral of her own mind. The truth is blurred, swallowed by shadow. What is certain is this: Isabella Banks died not with poison on her lips, but with paranoia in her veins. Alone, in a dimly lit room, surrounded by relics of power that meant nothing in the silence of death. Some said she took her own life, swallowing the same powders she had once prepared for others. Others insisted her enemies finally struck, finishing the work they had failed to complete years before. Her name was erased from polite society. Her scandals, her lovers, her whispered empire of secrets, all swept under the rug of history. But silence does not erase, it only buries. And in the corners of archives, in the diaries of forgotten aristocrats, Isabella's shadow remains. She was a woman who bent the rules of a world designed to consume her. She used poison when others used words, blackmail when others used wealth, and fear when others used bloodlines. She did not just survive. For a time she ruled, and that is why they hated her. That is why they erased her, because Isabella Banks was never meant to be remembered, but now you remember her.